deze faculteit natuurlijk. Hè? Ik open deze openbare vergadering van de promotiecommissie van de faculteit der Economische Wetenschappen en Bedrijfskunde met het uitspreken van het votum. Onze hulp is in de naam des Heren die hemel en aarde gemaakt heeft. Before asking the first opponent to speak, I invite the candidate to give an overview of the research on which the thesis is based.
Rector Magnificus, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending the defense of my dissertation. I'm going to spend a few moments explaining what it is that I researched before the defense begins. The research question, what is psychodynamic executive group coaching and why does it work, with whom and in what conditions, is essentially to form a theory which does not exist in social science literature currently. I'd like to give you a picture for those of you that are not familiar with this as an intervention, what might be happening here if you haven't read the research yet. Imagine that a group of executives, 28 executives, are taken to a business school. They're divided into groups of 4. They're assigned an executive coach, and they're offered the opportunity to spend a day together with that executive coach, with some feedback, with 360-degree feedback taken from their professional context, but also feedback taken from their personal realm. And this is where the psychodynamic element comes in. And they spend a day working through that feedback, the ambition being that at the end of the day they will formulate something that will help them to develop as individuals and to become maybe more psychologically healthy in both the professional and the personal realm, that their leadership will become more effective. A number of things happened during the course of that day. We asked them to do strange things in the executive forum, like drawing a self-portrait. And actually, sometimes we turn the chair around and have them look out of the window while people discuss them. It's a strange environment, and it's known as a transitional environment in the social sciences. It, on the one hand, takes them off balance, and on the other hand, it allows them to experiment a little bit with different aspects of themselves. The origins of this intervention were from the 1940s. The work of Kurt Lewin took executives out of their normal environment, places like Kodak, Xerox, General Electric, the household names that you'll be familiar with, and put them in what he called encounter groups. But these were not very well formulated. People sat together and essentially chatted. And by the 1980s, encounter groups, according to the social science literature, had fallen away and were debunked. Nevertheless, in the early 1990s, executive coaching was starting to take hold. At INSEAD, the Global Leadership Center was formed. Professor Engelor and Professor Ketz de Vries took a group of executives from the advanced management program and started to put them in groups and have them work through feedback with each other. And what happened actually was that they danced between the groups to try to facilitate them, realizing that they would get so much more from the experience if they assigned them a coach. This is precisely what they did, and this is how this intervention first started. So around 2000, 2001, this became much more formulaic. So why research it? A number of reasons. First of all, executive coaching has been proliferating over the last 15 to 20 years. But it's been proliferating in an unregulated way. It's rather fragmented still as a profession. When we looked at the data, and we've started to collect data in 2003 around this intervention, we could clearly see that it worked. And if something works, it's therefore important to understand why it works. Group coaching is poorly understood. In fact, group coaching is barely transacted anywhere. So this was a very good area for research, and moreover, there were some clear researchable components: the psychodynamic element, the group element, and the coaching element. What I felt by embarking on this was that if we could really understand it, it might be reproducible and generalizable across different populations beyond even executives. So what did I look at? Well, in order to produce something reasonable and a decent theory, I wanted to narrow down the search to something that I felt was understandable. So I looked at the International Executive Program. The International Executive Program is generally a cohort of around 60 people. Over 7 or 8 years, the results of the IEP were phenomenal. And I took one cohort and I studied that cohort 14 months after the end of the program itself. I ran a qualitative study. There was an opportunity, of course, to do a quantitative study, but frankly, because it wasn't properly understood, a qualitative study made more sense. I wanted to really dig into what had happened and why it had happened and what it meant to them. I observed the process end to end and annotated it in granular form. I ran an extensive literature review, not only of the meta-analysis of randomized control trials of the different elements of this, namely the psychodynamic therapeutic element, group process, and coaching, but also I ran a theoretical literature review as well, and that's reflected in the research. I discovered a number of interesting things, some actually quite unexpected, some very expected. As you would expect, psychodynamic approaches help people. When you self-reflect, when you begin to understand yourself better, you move forward broadly. This is not only true in psychotherapy, this is also true in group therapy, and seemingly from the literature also in coaching. When these three things are synthesized, which is essentially what happens in this intervention, they form a separate and discrete intervention of their own. The group element being the key variable. If you get a fantastic group, if you get an interesting group, a group that really engages, the participant will get so much more from the experience. Characteristics of talking cures, namely psychotherapy, group therapy, and all the other talking cures, counseling, mentoring, show up in this intervention, and they show up quite clearly. And when I talked to the practitioners, it became evident that there were some clear synergies between what they did in different types of talking intervention and what we were doing here. Things like the therapeutic alliance showed up as what we might now term the coaching alliance. Transitional phenomena showed up. Putting people into these rather strange spaces and have them reflect on themselves were clearly present in the literature and also were happening here. What I found that I discovered that was actually surprising is that beyond the life of the program and beyond the life of the intervention itself, these groups stayed intact. I studied the group, as I said, 14 months after the end of the program. They were still in touch with each other. They were not only still in touch with each other, they were supporting each other and engaging with each other on different subjects than the ones that they had engaged with each other at the time of the intervention itself. So clearly there is a human element to this which is powerful and useful. And there are other possible secondary gains which we may discuss during the course of this defense. But I did draw some conclusions. As you'd expect from a piece of research, you'd want to see something hard and concrete coming out of it. Well, I think what the number one thing that I discovered is that from these three different separate interventions, there is a dynamic interaction that creates a fourth discrete, reproducible, and I would propose generalisable process, which I would also propose is measurable going forward, although I didn't get to that level of data in this study. And I think from this you can hypothesize a theory as a theory stands in the social sciences. What I also discovered is that there are sustainable and predictable results. That when you look at this intervention, not only in the International Executive Program, but across other programs, across the business school, and in other geographies, there are good results, predictable results, if you create the right conditions. If there is containment and an adequate deployment of the intervention, it works and it will continue to work. The therapeutic alliance, and here I've put this in inverted commas, which becomes, if you like, the coaching alliance, is important. If trust is not built quickly, then this will not work, and that's a key and critical element to this. And then my final conclusion, which is to some extent my own conjecture, but talking with people, one can substantiate it, is that executives create meaning from going through a process like that. Meaning is a strange word, it's an often used word nowadays, but when I say that, it means they take more than just what's delivered from the intervention. It actually helps them in their lives, and they remember it, which I think is fascinating and also interesting. I'd like, if I have time, just to mention...
No, you don't have time anymore.
I do not have time.
Just
okay.
to conclude, one sentence.
So to conclude, there are a number of areas which we can research in the future. You'd expect this threw up more questions than answers. Some of these you can see on the slide here, and I think I would recommend that many of my learned colleagues would actually continue to research this, as will I. Thank you.
May I invite the members of the committee to come to the fore and take their seats. I would like to ask the candidate whether he is ready to defend his thesis.
Rector, on the authority and as authorised by the College of Deans, and in accordance with the Doctoral Examination Committee in the Faculty of Economics and Business Administration, I am prepared to defend my thesis entitled A Theory of Executive Coaching in Groups, the Clinical Psychodynamic Approach, in order to obtain the degree of doctor.
The first opponent is Dr. Anton Opholzer, affiliated with INSEAD as Executive Coach, the Global Leadership Center. Dr. Opholzer, we appreciate your willingness to participate in the discussion, and you have the floor.
Thank you. On the authority of the Rector Magnificus and by virtue of my right, I would like to ask Mr. Ward the following question, which I think is really quite central to the field, is there by implication in the thesis, and is, I think, of relevance to all in this area. My understanding is that in education, one of the central tenets of education is do no harm. And the same principle, in your view and mine, applies in the field of coaching and the group educational process. We therefore have an interesting situation, because we have a situation in which an individual enters into an arrangement, an educational arrangement, where they go in, and they go in as presumably with a specific self-image, a self-image that they have developed over many years, and a professional self-image. They then find themselves in a small group situation where one could say their self-image is questioned. It's questioned through 360-degree feedback. And so that they find themselves in a position, in a sense, overnight, of having to face elements of feedback, both in the form of statistics, but also in the form of comments that don't necessarily match their own self-image. What is more, this process of having your individual and personal self-image questioned isn't one that you can do in the comfort of a one-to-one relationship, but it's something that happens in a group process. So that, in a sense, your self-image being questioned not only has the image of the possible discomfort of the questioning of your self-image, but also has the reality of that being happening in public. And one could argue from a psychotherapeutic point of view that one of the elements that you might find in this group process is then a matter of shame, because it's not only a matter of your self-image, but your self-image being questioned and perhaps being perceived as somewhat flawed with blind spots, and that in public, in front of others. So one could argue that, at least from the point of view of the candidate in the initial phase, that could be perceived as harm. You know, for somebody to come along and say, hey ho, this is all very nice, but actually we see you differently, might be interpreted as harm. But we believe, and I think you make it clear in your thesis, that it is harm in the service of growth, development, and education. Nevertheless, at the time, it might not feel like that. So I wonder whether you could comment on this particular dilemma, which seems to me to be an integral part of the work that you're describing.
Learned opponent, thank you for your question. I'll make a number of statements, actually, in response. You are right in your supposition that there is risk attached to bringing people into an intervention like this, more risk than you would expect if one were just working with, for instance, an executive coach. I think the preparation that is required in order to make sure that no harm is done starts at the point of entry into the program itself, is amplified at the time when the intervention itself is explained to the group and to the individuals as to what they're going to experience, and is then carefully choreographed by the coach, him or herself. Moreover, post hoc, it is the prerogative of the coach to ensure that no harm has been done. I would therefore postulate that in order to do this work effectively and in order to provide a really strong insurance policy against harm, you need to have an element of psychological training that goes well beyond what is normally expected from a pure executive coaching qualification. I also think, to take a slightly different tack on this, that the element that may create harm is, in fact, the element that may actually do some good. The invitation on embarkation of a program or an intervention like this is, in fact, to take some risk with yourself. The invitation is if you take some risk with yourself, that you may learn something and develop in a way that you didn't expect to happen. But the invitation is accompanied by a caveat, and the caveat is that you will only be expected to go as far as you want to go, and that if you feel that you're going beyond a boundary that makes you feel uncomfortable, you can step back from that boundary. And I think by treating the candidate or the participant as an adult and allowing them to manage that boundary, and in the presence of someone that has some psychological sophistication and can handle that, the combination of those two things should produce a reasonably good outcome much of the time. I don't think you can ever provide 100% insurance policy against it. I'd like to say you could. I don't think that's possible. Do you feel that I've answered the question in a way that satisfies you?
Yeah, yes, I do. I feel that you've put it in context, and that, I think, it does help with the whole situation, and particularly puts it in the context of the co-workership between the coaches and the course overall. So with that context, I mean, what you're talking about is what's between the lines, which is something along the lines of warning. This process may at times feel toxic, but in the long run is actually a very good growth-inducing factor. I think that's been very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
The opponent seems to be satisfied, so we continue. I now give the floor to Professor Manfred Ketz de Vries, Clinical Professor of Leadership and Organizational Change at INSEAD and Chaired Professor of Leadership Development. Professor Ketz de Vries, we are honored with your presence and you have the floor.
Thank you. On the authority of the Rector Magnificus, and by virtue of my rights, Mr. Ward, I first want to compliment you for your thesis. It's a topic very close to my heart, as you probably know. And it's important that more people like you try to understand the underlying dynamics and the various theories behind it. And in that respect, you have made a contribution to the field to try to integrate three quite disparate fields in this area. I have two questions which are interrelated, actually. And the first question is, has always been important to me, having started with group intervention something like 22 years ago, and always being surprised how quickly it can be a trigger for change for people, how you can create tipping points in their lives. You know, using what I always call 720 feedback, not 360 feedback, 720 because it also is feedback not just from the business environment, but also from their personal life. It can be very powerful. Now, the first question, which is related to the other one, is what do you perceive as the levers that make group coaching particularly so effective? Because that's, as you know, our school is now the largest in the world in group coaching. And second, what makes group coaching so important in our cyber age? In this day and age, which is, a lot of changes are taking place in the environment, meaning that organizations are more and more complex. The old more authoritarian structures have disappeared. I always say going from the CCC, command control, to more information, innovation, a change kind of organization, matrix structures, having many bosses and things like that. So the first one is, what makes group coaching particularly so effective compared to one-to-one coaching? And why has the growth been so spectacular, for example, at our school, and now also in the world when you look at the literature?
Learned opponent, thank you for your question. Let me tackle your first question, which is around the levers that actually make this so effective. So I make a number of remarks about that. Clearly, as I made in my opening presentation, the group is central to this. And of course, the chemistry within the group is central to that. There are bad groups, and one area for future research are what actually is a bad group and what is, in fact, a bad intervention. But it doesn't happen very often. I think there are a number of things that produce favorable outcomes. Number one, as I've said in my earlier remarks about having a high degree of psychological sophistication. Number two, clearly the group provides two important elements. They provide support and they provide challenge. Very often in dyadic coaching, if the coachee disagrees with the coach, or if there are elements of disagreement, you end up in what you might sort of see analogously as a tennis match between the two, a disagreement that doesn't resolve itself. In my observation, working with these groups, when that starts to happen, very often the group will come either to the support of the candidate by doing one of two things, providing a different point of view, or actually challenging the candidate as to why they're disagreeing with the feedback. And I think that's an incredibly powerful lever. When I started doing this about 12 years ago, I found that I was actually incredibly skeptical as to whether it would work. And I found over time that it was not only working well, but actually the group, to some extent, were doing the job for me. And it is by far the biggest lever in the whole process. So you do need the group to come to your aid sometimes in order to get change to happen. But that last statement that I made is an important one because it's possible, given group dynamics and their complications, to actually lose the group. And you need to manage that process incredibly carefully. The other levers are that you're providing the group with an element and you're providing the participants with elements of hope. This is not psychotherapy. This is something that they perceive to be not only developmental, but if you wanted to be crass about it, will help them in their professional life to be more effective. And there is a very strong incentive. And so one of the key levers is that if they engage appropriately in the process, they will actually get something from it. There is almost a selfish gene that might kick in and come into play here. And that would be that with the output of the process, which is an action plan, and with the support of the group and of the coach beyond the program, that change can be made. And I think when you bundle it together, you get something that is rather seductive for most of the type A executives that come to participate in these kinds of programs. I think the other lever that I haven't touched on, which may well be close to your heart as well, is potentially the biggest one. And that would be the psychodynamic element. And that generally comes as a surprise to the participants because they do not expect, in a business school setting, to reveal aspects of themselves that very typically they wouldn't reveal in their working environment. And this is something that I hear a lot. I've said something to you here today that I would never say to any of the people that work with me, and I've never said it to anyone before. But by doing that and giving themselves the opportunity to, if you like, cognitively restructure their thinking around a certain topic, they can walk out almost having had an epiphany. And I think, we don't have the time to go into great detail about how that actually works here today, but I think it's essentially very important. And this is where this intervention differentiates itself quite clearly from most of the other behavioral coaching interventions that we see. Does that answer your first question, learned opponent?
Actually, I very much so. I would add something to it, that we sometimes underestimate the power of telling your story. The narrative is a very powerful thing, and realizing that you're not alone in your misery, that other people have similar things they share, which is what is already said in the context of mirroring.
Yeah.
And what about the second question?
So the second question, as I understood it, learned opponent, you asked me about the importance of such an intervention in what you termed the cyber age. My work in organizations as a consultant, and also having observed nearly 400 groups using this intervention, could be summed up as follows. And that is that very often these people are very alone. They are alone in their misery, as you put it succinctly just a moment ago. And so I'd like to just put that to one side and talk about a few other things. The second thing is the advent in the last 25 years of the matrix organization, where matrix organizations are complicated and leadership structures are not clearly understandable. I read something recently that said that the chances that you will have an informal conversation with a work colleague who works more than 30 meters away from you fall to around 0 nowadays in organizational life. So people do not communicate anymore. We are bound up with instant messaging, with electronic messaging, and bringing people together in an intervention like this, giving them an opportunity to not only reflect, and this is, after all, a reflective process, but to tell their stories, to think about themselves in a place which is safe, which is confidential, to give themselves an opportunity to work through their feedback when the stakes are actually lower than they normally are when they're in their working environment, where we have highly politicized working environments, where CEOs now last less than 3 years, and previously they would last 20 years, unstable working environments, I think provides an enormous benefit. And I hear in the feedback after events like this that is the case. And many people saying, I wish I'd done this many years ago. So I think this enhances the ability of people to truly engage and connect and to, if you like, rediscover their humanity, which is why I've become such a strong advocate of using this intervention. Learned opponent, does that answer your question?
Yes, I think you cannot email a smile or a handshake. And I guess when you have highly diverse, virtuous groups, which are all spread all over the place, and I'm very pleased to see Mr. Pot sitting there in the corner, because he was so kind to let Elizabeth and I experiment with this particular process. We discovered the real power of bringing those groups together and make them work together. Thank you very much. I'm very satisfied.
Thank you.
I would like to invite Professor Anton Kozijnse, Professor of Change Management at our faculty, to continue the discussion. Professor Kozijnse, you have the floor.
on the authority of the rector and by virtue of my rights, dear Mr. Ward, your subject has fascinated me. Therefore, I have read your thesis with the utmost interest. Thank you. My compliments. However, it seems me very complicated when you want to research group therapy, short-term psychodynamic psychotherapy, and executive coaching, and the combination of these three cornerstones of the change process. And even more, it is complicated when I read your own research questions, and that is, are these three approaches as a single intervention effective, valid, and replicable? And not only in executive sphere, but do they also have possibilities in other social environments? So my first question, what is effective for you and what does it relate to? Does it relate to the methods themselves or to the end result, namely a successful process or successful change?
Learned opponent, thank you for your interesting and insightful question, and I will try to answer that. It's a great question because effective, of course, says everything but says nothing. I would think about this on almost a longitudinal perspective and think about the 12 years in which I've been engaged in delivering this intervention, and think about in the first place, the kind of responses, not that I see from a quantitative perspective, but actually the qualitative remarks that I see as a result of going through it, not only on the International Executive Programme, but on a whole plethora of interventions that we deliver both to companies and to open enrollment type programs. Clearly, most people that respond, and we cannot actually at this point deal with the people that do not respond to the survey after post hoc, but the people that respond find this to be powerful, and they find it to be powerful in a number of ways. At a very base level, they make remarks like, this has helped me to move forward in my professional life, this will enhance my leadership capability. But from at the other end of that continuum, you often see remarks like, this for me has changed the game. This came out of left field. It was wholly unexpected. I have never put myself through this kind of lens before. And so from one point of view, effective could really be summed up by saying, did it give the person a sufficient insight that they were able to move forward in a way that they wanted to move forward, and leave it at that? On the other hand, you could measure it, and you could say, well, I would like to become more quantitative and really measure to what extent it has impact and over what period of time. And implied in my research, as I know that you've read, I do say that the difference to the results 3 months after the intervention are obviously slightly different to the results that you get 14 months after the intervention. If I had a suspicion, it would be that 5 years after the intervention, the half-life has fallen to practically zero. And so effective, if you wanted to think of it from a purely quantitative point of view, does the leadership change that we're looking for really end up being sustainable over a long period of time? I can't answer that question. I don't know.
Yes, but I have no other question. So you write on page 142, my intuition is the best coach. Or, as a practitioner, it is difficult to know if the session has been successfully. So my question is intuition then the standard for effectiveness or for success?
So, of course, to take this in context, this is, of course, a remark from one executive coach who had worked on this intervention. And thank you for this question, because I think we now get to really the heart of the matter. Is it intuition or is it actually working? Do we know the answer to this question? The numbers say yes. The numbers when you look at that, and I think earlier in the piece of research, you see the numbers self-reported over 14 cohorts of the program, and I think I looked at 464 participants over 5 years. The numbers say, I liked this, it helped me. The fact that it was in a group setting, I respond to very positively. I'm able to do something with this. So from that point of view, yes, it's effective. And of course, we have to take that through the lens of it was effective with that particular cohort of people in that program. Is it effective? Really, then we need to get down to effective as what? As a change mechanism, I believe this is extremely effective, and I would actually hypothesize that you could not only use this in the executive realm, but in other realms too. Because as a process and as a methodology, it takes people into 2 or 3 different spheres that interlock very nicely. And so my answer to the question is yes, I believe it's effective, and I think one can impute enough from the research to suggest that it is. But I think it requires further investigation, and I think that investigation would necessarily need to be quantitative. Does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Thank you, learned opponent.
You're satisfied, dear
Yes.
colleague? Fine then. Then the last opponent in this first round of opposition is Professor Tjart de Kok-Buning, Professor of Applied Ethics in Life Sciences at this university. We really appreciate your willingness, Professor de Kok-Buning, to replace Professor Mark van Vught at this very last moment. Professor van Vught could not be present due to personal circumstances. Professor de Kok-Buning, you have the floor.
On the authority of the Rector Magnificus and by virtue of my right, I like to compliment the candidate for a very inspiring and sort of thesis you placed here. I also realize when I take now the word that you don't know anything about me. It might be a threatening position, but I understood from your introduction that you've been standing for a lot of fires and that it must be all right. So I will address you regarding some basic assumptions behind your thesis. I'm myself working also with task groups at ministries, doing complex tasks and policy making, and I do the coaching over there. That are high professionals, and probably you also understand it is not wise in this kind of task group of a ministry to start up with a psychological analysis, because it's quite vulnerable in that situation. I also work with master students who has to be in a transition from being only a bachelor student, accepting everything what is written in a book, up to a full autonomous scientific thinking person. And especially on that transition, we do the usual things like group work and coaching, and the usual things like core quadrant analysis to understand themselves and what are their weak points and allergies, and Bellwins to find out how they work in teams. And I don't have to be irritated, but just have to acknowledge the talents over there. And somehow it does not work. And I'm very interested whether your additional step, the third pillar of psychodynamics or psychoanalyst model, might help. By the way, this is only the stepping up to the other question, so please answer it shortly.
Learned opponent, I will try to be succinct in anticipation of what's to come. I do believe that it is the biggest swing factor. And I believe it's the biggest swing factor because through actually my clinical observations of the process firsthand. And I'll be brief, but these are what they are. We start the intervention with a self-portrait where somebody will stand, not only draw themselves through a number of psychological dimensions.
May I just interrupt to you?
Yes.
I know your argument and also your enthusiasm about it. You explained it in your thesis and also on this table. But I'm interested when you just transfer your model to the model of master students who have to do the same kind of transition in their mind and become a more mature person and stepping away from the loneliness and stepping away from the social interactions that they have as an answer to that. How should you accomplish that? You start also with a drawing of their own and their own biohistory, or?
Indeed. The process starts before they even arrive. The process of reflection starts with a very detailed questionnaire that allows them to start the process, or even the fantasy that they may be stepping into something that is not as business orientated as they first thought. This generates maybe the beginning of the feeling of being slightly off balance. My supposition is that in order to really effect change, and I think this comes then back hopefully to your question, learned opponent, is that by creating that feeling of imbalance, you're then able to play a little bit with the person. The group has the ability and the facility to play with them to some extent, and most importantly, in this transitional environment, they can experience themselves differently.
May I disagree with you? What I observe in these groups is that they are highly anxious in disclosing their own personal background, because they are now, for the first time, coming all over the world, so it's the same kind of group as you have, only the age is different, and they have all kinds of different paths and different backgrounds, and by portraying them in their own, say, nakedness, is the last thing that you want to do, in contrast to your group. So can you explain me why?
Why, learned opponent, I will try to explain why. I would refer to something that I said earlier, which is really about invitation. And the invitation is to do something that they've never done before, but it is purely an invitation, to take themselves as far as they want to go. There is, however, a trick. And one of the tricks would be that as a trained coach, as a trained facilitator of these types of groups, we look at people and try to get a sense from the feedback, from the biography, from the portraits that have been drawn, who might be a reasonably good proxy to get this process going. And I think that is, on the one hand, intuitive, but on the one hand is pattern recognition that comes from having enacted it a number of times. If you can get that right, you have the conditions for a very wholesome day.
Okay, I can take that argument. I see that might be a very good, say, pooling element for the whole group when you see that. And that brings me to the other question. Would it be not better in the case, and I still have some doubts about my master group still, to just approach them from a cognitive behavioral model? Because that is a little bit away from that very sensitive personality, which they, I think, don't recognize or didn't explore it yet enough.
Learned opponent, thank you for your question. And if there is a suspicion that I would get drawn into the 50-year debate between cognitive behavioralists and psychodynamic theoreticians, I'm not going to dare to step into that in this forum. Nevertheless, I think the question is a good one. And the reality is that in order to really understand the answer to that question, one would need to run this process in tandem with a cognitive behavioral group and try to assess outcome or effectiveness, as was recently put, one versus the other, or even against control groups. I'm not going to stand here and recommend one process over another.
I can understand your say, stepping aside from this question, but still I want to a little bit trigger you and challenge you in it. You wrote in, I have to put the page on it, 150. Yes. When you entered your discussion from your meta-analysis. You just wanted to find out what are known data that support the psychological analytical models and what are the cognitive behavioral models. And then you came to the conclusion that actually from the outcomes, that there's not a real difference between them. So they are actually equally for to make a choice. And you make the choice. You say, I go for the more psychological analytical aspects. But you didn't describe the arguments, the scientific arguments for the choice. And you said, well, I understand, of course, you are working in that area. You got beautiful and very good coaches in that area. So that isn't actually your hunting field where you've been working. But from a scientific point of view, I'm a little bit disappointed. I wanted to see that you are not looking to a black box of cognitive behavioral data and a black box of those psychological and dynamic issues, and only look to the outcomes. And you know it very well, actually. Because when I go to 150, you say, in one of your conclusions, well, as a practitioner, it would be of no interest to me to work in another matter. I do not doubt in its efficacy. That is just what you're now talking about. Driving a Volvo still gets down the road as well as an Aston Martin. The experience, however, is markedly different. And here you relate to something of the content of the black box. Yeah? And that is quite inconsistently. Do you have something next to the pragmatics? Pragmatics that you have been working in an environment where that was the test case. Did you find something more in the content, as it doesn't matter, in the content why it is more important? And I don't accept your argument that you've seen hundreds and thousands of good consequences, because that is the argument that Popper broke with Adler and started with his, program of falsification.
Learned opponent, thank you, and thank you for challenging me further, because it actually stimulates my thinking on the matter. The answer to the question is essentially that in beginning this research, I did set out to create a theory from something that just did not exist to date. I was looking at an intervention that was a psychodynamic intervention. In going through the process of studying it, I actually became rather absorbed and in fact took quite a big diversion along the cognitive behavioral route, because the meta-analysis of the randomized control trials started to throw up interesting data that made me wonder whether or not, in fact, if we stripped back and pared back the psychodynamic element, this indeed would work. The challenge for me was really to not lose the thread of creating the theory. The theory, as far as I was concerned, was to understand the what and the why and the how of what was going on here, and at the same time accepting that it's quite possible that running an analogous process, taking out any one of these elements, might be just as effective. And in fact, as part of the literature review, and I think I state it somewhere in the research, what one could almost postulate would be that, and it's glib to say so, but sitting in a room with somebody going through this might actually be the thing that makes the difference to that one individual. But we cannot know, because the individual is the individual unit of analysis, and we never know how one individual will respond differently to another. So even running randomized control trials, we would never actually necessarily get right to the bottom of it.
Does this satisfy your questions? Not completely yet.
I'm satisfied.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. We do have a number of questions formulated by committee members who could not be present. One of these members is Professor Mark van Vught. I already mentioned his name, and his question will be read by one of the supervisors, Professor Erik van der Loo. You have the floor.
On the authority of the Rector Magnificus and by virtue of my right, I would like you to answer a question. And I will read the question as formulated and sent for the ceremony by Professor van Vught. Dear candidate, congratulations on a fine thesis. I'm sorry I can only be here in spirit. Nevertheless, I would like to hassle you with a question. Yours is a nicely written thesis on an important theme, the benefits of group coaching for executives. As you may know, I am not so familiar with the qualitative and psychodynamic approach. I am more familiar with the field of group dynamics, and this is what my questions focus on. This field was founded partly by Kurt Lewin. In the process of social change, he identified 3 stages: unfreeze, change, refreeze. This model is summarized in your thesis. Yet what is missing in your thesis is the group focus and the experimental method Lewin advocated. According to Lewin, groups are an effective way of inducing change because of the influence of social norms. He found this out when he tried to get housewives in World War II to prepare organ meat like kidney and liver for dinner. All the good meat was being shipped overseas to American soldiers in Europe and the Pacific. Lewin compared 2 methods to bring about change in the cooking habits: the lecture method and the group discussion method. He found that the latter one, so the group discussion method, was 5 times more effective in inducing change in the housewives. Why? His analysis showed that this was due to the housewives being able to discuss the new cooking method and then decide on their choice in public. So the effect of the group method boiled down to a public commitment made by the housewives. So inspired by Lewin, my questions are threefold. 1. Why did you not use the Lewinian experimental approach where you compare group coaching to a control group that simply received a lecture? 2. Is the real benefit of the group coaching that you found not simply due to a change in social norms, a public commitment from the executives to promise to change the way they work? And 3, lastly, do you have data to show this might be the explanation for your findings?
Learned opponent in absentia, thank you for these 3 questions, and I will try to answer them in the order in which you've presented them. The first question, as I understand it, is whether to use why I did not use a control group, why I didn't make a comparison. And without wishing to sound glib, I think that the control group had already been tried. I think that the reason that executive coaching has taken hold the way that it has, and I think the reason that not only has it taken hold in organisational focus, but actually especially in business schools, is because lectures just do not work. That in order to get change to happen, in order to get anything to happen that's effective, you need people to experience something and to step into a realm in which they're not comfortable or dependent. And as I see it, a lecture is a dependency. In fact, there's an invitation to pay attention, but not necessarily, it's not necessarily going to happen. And whilst it would have been interesting, my supposition is we have moved a stage further than to do that. I think I could predict the results, but I wouldn't dare, because it wouldn't be scientific to do so if we were to run such an experiment. And I think, if we need to prove that this is the way forward and that this works as compared to a control, we should. I did not, and maybe I jumped the gun by not doing so. But my feeling is that the efficacy of this process was so apparent from the comments that were made from the people that went through it, and also from the scores that they attributed to it, that it wouldn't necessarily have been a very useful finding to have that. I'd like to talk about respond to this question about the benefit of social norms. In this intervention, the people that participate don't have a lot of opportunity to get used to each other. But the way that this is designed is in such a way that they know each other well enough, to use a psychological term. If they get too close, they actually don't do the job. And if they are complete strangers, there's no job to do. And so I would actually postulate that there are social norms in these groups, and that the design of the way that we deliver this is very much in balance. And I would be, in the absence of the professor, I would actually have liked to debate this with him a little bit. And I don't know if you would care to join that, but I believe that we do establish some social norms and that they are good enough. And as far as the third question is concerned, I think it's an absolutely relevant question. I deliberately, as I remarked earlier, did not embark on a quantitative study. I think that the follow-up to this research, now that we fully understand, I believe we fully understand the theory of this, would be to do just that and substantiate it with some data. I believe there is enough data contained in the research to show that way forward as a pathfinder. I don't believe the data in my research is sufficient to substantiate anything further than that.
Thank you.
Do you think that Professor Van Vught would be satisfied with this answer?
I think so.
You think so? Okay. Then we continue. I'd like to give the floor to Professor Gets de Vries, who will read a question formulated by Professor Roger Lehmann. I would like to advise you to formulate it briefly if you'd like to have an answer.
Okay.
So skip the first part.
Yeah, first part. On the authority of the Rector
Ask the
Magnificus
question.
and by virtue of my rights and respect to Roger Lehmann, I will not read the whole pretext. He compliments you for your dissertation, a fine piece of work. But what he is asking is that given the system psychodynamic perspective, one has to group coaching, there has been a debate about what background, what training the people should have. Should he be steeped in business? Should he be steeped in psychology? Should he be steeped in both? And what are the implications of your answer for the education and training of executive coaches?
Learned opponent, thank you for your...
You already touched upon it, by the way.
I'm sorry?
You already touched about it earlier.
Yes. Thank you for your question. I believe I'm being asked for an opinion, and my opinion is that having business experience is useful when delivering this intervention, but the intervention as outlined in the research requires you to have psychological training. The level of psychological training that's required is open to debate, but no psychological training would necessarily preclude you from delivering this intervention. And I would refer back to Professor Opholz's question earlier, in as much as it would actually potentially do harm. So I'm not sure if that completely answers what it is that you would want to hear, but...
I guess we have... but I think it would, since we're run out of time, it would satisfy Professor Lehmann.
Yeah. Thank you. Rector Magnificus, now that my defense has ended, I sincerely thank my opponents for the attention that they have devoted to my thesis. I now look forward to the decision of the Doctoral Examination Committee in the Faculty of Economics and Business Administration, which will decide whether the degree of doctor will be granted to me.
I hereby adjourn this meeting of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Economics and Business Administration for further deliberations.